Well, hello and welcome to the Creating Connections podcast, where I bring voices and perspectives from people who are making a difference for children's learning and development. I'm Rachel Stewart, and I'm passionate about connecting with people to share experiences and learn from each other how we can best support children to thrive. In this series of the podcast, I interview successful leaders in education so you can learn from a diverse range of people what makes a successful leader and how you can take their learnings and apply them to your leadership. Today, I'm introducing you to Mark Smith, who is an innovative educator with over 30 years' experience in the Victorian independent school system. His work centres on gifted and talented education, which includes the creation and implementation of multifaceted school-wide programs at some of Melbourne's largest independent schools. An advocate for inquiry-based learning, Mark has facilitated outstanding results for students of all ages using a mentoring approach to cultivate engaging experiences that lead to student agency and transformational learning. In this episode, I'll explore Mark's work and journey through education in further detail, and you'll learn more about his book, Mentoring for Talent, and his passion for mentoring gifted and talented children to support their whole development. So I hope you enjoy this interview with Mark Smith on the podcast today. Well, I'd like to officially welcome you to the Creating Connections podcast. And as you know, I interview educators such as yourself who are doing amazing work and innovating in education, and I have a common interest with you in understanding more about gifted and talented children and how they're being supported in our schools. And I myself, I've just started working with some gifted children and helping them with their cognitive development skills. So it's a really interesting space, and I think that it's a good opportunity to share your knowledge of what you've done in the last 30 years in education. But also to explore what you see is going to be some changes that are happening in the future around the way that we teach and the way that we coach and mentor students. So perhaps you can start by sharing where it all started for you and how you got into education and how you've ended up in this space of really supporting and nurturing those amazing students.
Well, yeah, thanks for having me, Rachel. It's really good to be on your recording. I grew up in a country town. I mentioned it in the introduction of my book. I was in a tiny little school, little primary school, and I really enjoyed the school experience, even though I didn't feel like I was a very academic person. But I loved the social aspect, and I loved the connections with other students and with my teachers. So I really enjoyed primary school and of course the sport and the social connection that you have through sport. When I went to high school in a local town not far from my primary school, I did work experience in year 10 as a teacher in a primary school, and I really enjoyed that process. And I think pretty much from there, I thought I'd be a teacher. So I taught initially in a local town near where my family were living in South Gippsland, and I taught there for 2 years. And from there, after 2 years, I ended up in a large independent school in Melbourne. So I was married, moved with my new wife to Melbourne. She was a Melbourne person, and I started working in this large independent school. I was initially a primary teacher and a PE specialist in that large independent school. But over time, having been a PE specialist and a primary teacher in the school, I was really looking for something different. And I'd been teaching upper primary in the school as a classroom teacher. And I found that I had students that were of high ability in my class that I really struggled to cater for. And I wanted to know more about how I could upskill myself to do that. So I ended up enrolling in a course, a postgraduate certificate of gifted education at Monash University. It was just 2 subjects. And that started my journey in gifted ed. So it was a postgraduate certificate of gifted education. And once I completed the course, the school were very interested in promoting the area, and they asked if I could take on the role of coordinator of gifted and talented in the primary school, which I did, and I loved it. I knew a fair bit about what I might do from what I learned at university, but the school very quickly supported me with professional development and conferences, and I wrote my first program in that first year. And I had initially just 16 students. And by the end of that year, I had 32. So it was a bit of a slow burn to begin with. But I ran that program for a decade. And by the time I finished at that school, there were 140 students that I was supporting with the help of other educators in the school. And we were providing a really rich program that involved, well, initially I helped with differentiation and supporting teachers to be better at differentiating in their classrooms, but I was also running pull-out programs and extension programs of my own that I felt the students would benefit from. And sometimes the students had input into things that I would do. And part of that also was mentoring.
Yeah.
And mentoring very quickly took hold. And that's why I wrote the book eventually, a few decades on.
Yeah. Well, I just want to take you back to your own experience at school. And when I was reading your book, I realized that there was, and I'm finding this when I'm interviewing people, that there's so many similarities in the way that uh, our stories kind of line up, which is interesting how we have come together and connected because growing up in a country town in a small community and really uh, feeling what that or knowing what that feels like to be a part of a community where everyone knows each other and everyone supports each other and you meet up on the weekends at sport or church or
Yes.
so it's a very different upbringing and that carefree upbringing in the country as well. And I experienced the same thing and also ended up in education in supporting, families and schools to come together to work as a community. So how has that influenced your work in terms of being in tune with your students and other teachers and the families? So we know it's not just about teachers, it's not just about students and not just about leaders and families, it's about the
Yes.
whole community. So how has that influenced your work in terms of how you've actually created a new community of gifted and talented children, but also educators and their families?
Hmm. Yeah, look, it did get to the point where I felt like I got to know the whole family of those students that I was working with in that large independent school, especially over the 10 years that I did the role. Uh, I I kind of felt like I journeyed on the bus with those students because classroom teachers will see their students for a year in the primary school and then they pass them on. But in my role, they just continued with me right through those years. Some of them from foundation in year one right through to the end of primary school. And I journeyed with them and their families right through. So it involved, obviously, some identification of those students, and often that started with assessments that they might already have through like a Wechsler or a Stanford Binet assessment, so a formal IQ type test. But we were also doing a lot of educational testing in the school as well. So teachers were picking up students that they felt were very able, and I was working with them. But sometimes the identification process and the assessment involved getting to know the family if they were having an outsourced test. Uh, Other students were on individual learning plans to support them through their program. So I got to know the families there as we met very regularly on their goals and progress checking. And just through the everyday programming, the things that we were doing, a lot of it was out of school. We would go off and compete in a competition against other schools elsewhere. Often parents would take their their children to those competitions, and sometimes I would spend a full day with parents while the students were competing. So I felt like I really got to know the students, but I also got to know their families. And I mean, a good primary teacher will, well, they'll want to know about their students anyway. They'll want to know about their students' families, their siblings, their pets, those sorts of things, because it's just general interest and it helps us to connect. But I felt that was something that was very long term for me in the time that I worked in that school over that long period of time, especially those ones that I started with and I worked with right through their primary years.
Yeah. And of
Mm.
course, the influence of the families is so critical in the success of the student as well.
Definitely, yes.
So,
Yeah.
how did you work with the families in helping them understand their child as a gifted child? And I suppose it's in some ways a label or an identity that has been created to explain or describe a child who is exceptional in some areas. But of course, children are not exceptional in every area,
Mm.
not usually. So how did you work with the families to help them understand what was it that's different about their child, but also how can they treat their child as, not as putting them on a pedestals as such, but as an exceptional learner and
Mm.
as a whole person.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I've always felt like parents they know their students best or their kids best, so they are a fantastic resource for teachers. And I always came at it from that angle. I felt that what they had to say was really important in informing the journey with their child. And I think I made that very clear right from the beginning. So for some, they felt very comfortable because that was my approach. I still expected that they would have respect of the profession and my training and the things that I did and the suggestions that I made. Uh, and I would like to involve the child as well. Where they were old enough to have valuable input into their programming, the things that they did, I felt it was important that they had a level of ownership and input, because that we're in it together. It's a three-way process, children, parents, and teachers. So I felt I had a really excellent relationship with families. Sometimes there are challenges and you have disagreements, but I would always hope that we would respectfully agree to work through a process, because we would parents and myself were doing it in the best interests of their child. And I felt they knew that.
Yeah.
So it was overwhelmingly positive. And when I left that school to go to another, it was really, really quite hard to leave the students and the families who I'd got to know, uh, just because of the relationship that had been developed and the successful journey that we'd been on for their child. And like I say, I feel like you travel on the bus with them,
Yeah.
um, because you are there for the duration of the journey, in being a specialist that supports them in a specialised area. Mm.
Yeah. And it really highlights just how important that relationship is. How
Yes.
you actually emphasize that in your book around the relationship between teachers and students. So I'd love for you to share how you get to know your students, apart from what you've already shared, speaking with the family and tapping into that parent knowledge. How do you actually get to know the students in a way that supports you to design the programs for them? And what sort of advice would you give to teachers and other leaders around really focusing on that teacher-student relationship?
Mm. My role evolved over the years from primary into secondary. So in more recent times, I've worked a lot more with secondary students, right up to year 12 students. So I've had experience from foundation to year 12. Uh, what I've always found has been doing an interview with students. So I had a bit of I guess it's a semi-formal type interview with some little questions that I'd ask them. Initially, just about themselves, their interests, the things that they love doing, their passions, what sort of clubs and involvements they have outside school. And that would sort of move through to setting, some goals for what they'd like to achieve, outside school this year, what they'd like to achieve at school this year, right through to how they think they learn. So you might not do that question with the young primary students because they don't necessarily know yet. And even some of the older primary students sometimes struggle a bit with that question. And I've even found year 12s on occasion don't know how they learn best. So that's a real surprise. But I normally ask them that question. What is your best way of learning? Are you a visual learner? Do you learn best through reading and researching? Do you like to inquire for yourself and ask questions? All the different ranges, and I just get their feedback on what they think.
Yeah.
And I find that's a really good starting point. What are you hoping for this year? And not just concentrating on school, but also looking outside it. I'm a very goal orientated type person, quite quantitative in my approach. I like to be able to measure things and make sure they're working. And sometimes I've really had to push that aside and get to know the child. So understand them more from perhaps a qualitative type perspective, where we're having those discussions. And I found mentoring was a really, really good way of doing it. So that sort of the mentoring line, it came in to support work in some specific areas, as you would have read in the book. But it has really been a great relationship builder for me with those students that I've worked with, because you always start with how's life, what's happening, what have your successes been this week, what have your challenges been this week. And we're not just talking about school, we're talking about, potentially at home as well. Yeah, so you're trying to get to know their lives as well as them as students. And, I think where you do that, you really build that rapport.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is essential in them feeling a sense of belonging and feeling comfortable with you. And we know that students will learn best when they feel comfortable in a setting and when, they feel, a sense of connection and belonging. Yeah.
Yeah. And basically being heard as well. Being asked
Definitely.
questions.
Yes.
I think they're fantastic questions to ask all kids, really, because
Yes.
even as adults, a lot of adults don't even know how they learn. And I myself, I don't think I really understood it until I started teaching myself as an
Yes.
adult educator, and realized, oh, actually, yeah, I'm a visual learner. I didn't even know any of
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
Teachers obviously know, but a lot of students probably never get asked those questions. So just even to be asked about that and to have to think about that is a really different approach. So what in those conversations, what do you find out about those children in terms of what does make them gifted and what makes them a little different? And what sort of other interests do they have that you think contributes to them being gifted in terms of, I guess, playing sport, doing music, all the different other things they do outside of school that actually build those cognitive skills that really help them to be better learners?
Mm. Yeah, look, often gifted kids, particularly highly, highly gifted kids, I'm talking very high IQ students, they sort of deficits will creep in, like that are challenges to them, and they might be social challenges, they might be organisational challenges. Um, you know, um, it could be an auditory processing challenge potentially, but the challenges can vary enormously. I find that we have twice exceptional students who have obviously very high ability in one area or more areas, but they also have these deficits which inhibit them or mask their abilities.
Yeah.
But I also find, and I guess it is a form of twice exceptionality, the very highly able students just struggling in those often social, often organisational domains. So I
And
try and draw that out in our discussions. We want it to be an open, transparent discussion because I'm here to help them, and I've got their best interests at heart, and I hope that they'll feel that they can share what they feel the challenges are when we explore those questions. But I also like to find out what they feel their strengths are, because I think with any student, it's always best to start with their strengths and to develop those and support them in those, because that's where their confidence builds, and that's where they again feel that sense of belonging and connection, and with your support they feel like they can tackle some of the challenges that they might face.
yeah,
And then slowly but surely a lot of them do tackle them, or they'll find workarounds that help them to be successful in those areas. So what I do is a lot about their self-actualization, I guess, and them understanding themselves as individuals, but also exploring some of those ways in which they can, make the strength stronger and overcome or work around the challenges. And again, mentoring is a great way of doing that because of the very specific goal setting that you use, and then those formative discussions that you have from week to week on their progress,
yeah.
which will inform the new goals and determine the direction they head in for the next little bit. And again, you're expressing and showing your absolute interest in what it is they're doing, and you're supporting them in the process. I mean, yeah, it's a really optimistic process. You're always being positive. You're always encouraging, even when things are difficult. You're realistic, but this is part of life, and we've just got to work through it. But yeah, it's a really positive, optimistic outlook, and I've always felt mentoring is that, and it needs to be in order to really help the students. You are a person. The mentor is a person in their corner.
Mm.
And you're backing them all the time. You're always going to turn up. You'll be there before them. You'll be there after them, and you're just supporting them on their journey. And yeah, that trust that builds as a result of that is really, really positive.
I really love hearing your passion coming through. And I love that you mentioned self-actualization, which is obviously the top of the hierarchy of needs.
Mm,
And that's the first time I've heard anyone say that in education. And that is quite a breakthrough moment, I think, because self-actualization is probably not an area that many educators explore with students, but I'm very intrigued to know how you do that. And I suppose as a coach myself and a mentor, that process does come through the coaching mentor
mm,
modeling of
yeah.
how you ask questions, how you structure questions, and how you dig a little deeper into the subconscious of what's actually going on in that person's mind and in their subconscious. So how do you actually do that? Do you have a structure or a model that you use, or is it something that comes naturally to you as a coach and
I
mentor?
think I think it comes quite naturally, especially as you move through the journey with a student. Some students you're mentoring for years and years, whether it be through an inquiry competition project, or or through um, an individual learning plan that you're involved in, or year 12s obviously, it's a final year, but you feel like even if you're not formally meeting students all the time, because you're working with them regularly, you feel like you're almost mentoring them informally, because you'll be on yard duty and you'll see the student, and it'll be, how things going. You've just always got those. You've got that connection through the work that you've been doing, and you just make the most of it at every turn. Um, The mentoring and coaching one is really interesting. Like, mentoring is obviously a really directive process, and many schools are teachers are naturally quite directive in their approach, partly because of their training as educators. Whereas the coaching is a lot more participatory. So using questions a whole lot more to direct, I guess, some of the thought process and help students to solve their own problems. So obviously mentoring, I see mentoring as perhaps a first step, but when students are ready for the coaching and we want them to become active participants in their own learning, let's move to coaching. And I do share in my book a chapter where that happens, and I share a case study of that. And I think that's where you really start to delve into some of those areas for students that are a bit deeper for them, even around things like, they're grappling with a concept. And why is it that they're grappling with it? And just getting them to look at their inner self a whole lot more. I've actually got quite a good example of a Year 12 student talking case studies. One that I worked with fairly recently in a school, and she was a fascinating case because, and I think she really went quite a way through a self-actualization journey in 1 year in Year 12. She was a new student to the school I was working in, and I mentored her from the start of the year. She'd been identified in a very different way. She hadn't been identified as a student that I should work with in the mentoring program because of assessment, because she hadn't performed that well in assessment. But teachers had observed that her ability in class discussions and collaborations was like off the charts good. And she just led the other students. And although her grades were around the 70% mark, this student was different, and she was very able, and we needed to explore that a bit more. So I worked with her. In the first 4 or 5 weeks, we kind of just tread water. Lots of questions back and forth. I mentored her, I directed her with goal setting, but then lots of questions. She'd done the survey with me at the start of the year. I couldn't understand why a student like her, who was so articulate, couldn't perform better in the classroom. And then we just started to explore some reasons why. And there were 3 revelations for her during the course of the year, which I found fascinating. The first one was she wasn't very good at planning essays, and she didn't know really where to start. She didn't really have a formal process. And although she'd been given some frameworks, she wasn't really following them. So
That's a bit like me trying to write my book.
so we looked at some graphic organisers of just some essay plans, and we looked at ones that were quite generic that could be used in multiple subjects. And I really encouraged her to try to use them because I felt that if she had a great essay plan, she'd write a great essay. She was just such a clever girl. And she said, all right, I'll give it a try, but it'll have to work. Otherwise, I won't be convinced. So anyway, she gave it a go for a couple of essays, and she went from 70 to 90% in her grades. And after 2 or 3 essays, it was like, no, this is how I'm going to do it from now on. So that was great. That was a real positive.
Transformational.
Sorry?
Transformational experience.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. The second thing for her was she was actually not very organised. She was an absolute scrambler. From day to day, she scrambled through her day. Yeah. And we worked out between us, just through a bit of questioning back and forth, that there were probably about 7 things that would really help her. So if she addressed those 7 things the night before for the next day, in terms of organisation, let's see how her day turns out. So we did that and again, it had to work. Otherwise, she wasn't going to pursue it. But she gave it a go for a couple of weeks and said She couldn't believe how much time she had on her hands. If she followed that disciplined process of those 7 things each evening for the following day, she had spare time in her day, which she said even made a difference to her social interactions, because she felt like she couldn't connect with her peers because she was just scrambling through her work. Whereas once she was more organised, she was more connected with them as well.
Yeah.
And so that was a real positive, just working through that. And she might, I don't know what she's doing today in terms of her organisation, but it wouldn't surprise me if she was going through her 7.
I'm
And
sure
then
you've had a huge impact there, because imagine if you were still scrambling as an adult,
there was
which
a third
happens
thing
to a
though
lot of
with
people.
her. A third thing, and you might have read it in the book because she is a case study, but she didn't understand herself as a learner either.
Yeah.
The way she was trying to learn information and content for tests and revise was just, no, it was never going to work for her. She was a visual learner. I'd started to see that through the essay planning with the graphic organisers. And she needed to map her units of work like a story. And if she did that and actually created a mind map for a unit or an area of content and stuck it on a wall, she would never forget it.
Yeah.
So she just did that, and she scaffolded over the course of the year her mind maps. And if she went into an assessment and she was being tested on, enzymes in biology or something like that, she knew exactly where it was on a wall.
Yeah.
And she'd just go to that place.
Visualizing. Mm.
Yeah. And she felt invincible in assessments once she had that process in place, because and she knew even before the final exams, I am going to nail these because I just know what to do. So this was a real journey of self-actualization for the student. And
Yeah.
look, she did very well. What I found really interesting, she got a very high 90s ATAR, but and that was great. But I think the journey she went on as an individual and what she learned about herself during that year was really more valuable probably than a high ATAR score, because she can take that with her through her life. So that was a real revelation for her. And I often wondered if I'd been able to work with that student for 2 or 3 years, just how far she would have gone even in that year 12 year, because she had to learn all this during her year 12 and then try and perform in the final exam. So, it was, she was a real success story, and she shared in the book. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's an amazing story and a demonstration of how important personalization is. And really, I love how the teachers actually saw that in her
Yeah. Yeah.
and referred her to your program, because just being in tune with how that person articulated themselves but was very scattered otherwise, which
Mm.
is that a trait in a lot of gifted children anyway? Is it a case of like highly creative, highly critical thinkers, and really have a lot of thinking going on inside their brains, but they don't necessarily know how to put it out on paper or express it? Perhaps verbally they can, but maybe not through their writing. Or are you seeing that in a lot of children, where once you do personalize and you explore where their strengths are and where their challenges are you finding that that is the case, where their executive functioning skills are quite needing further support?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's really interesting, and I don't want to generalize, but often kids around sort of the 120, 130 IQ mark, they tend to have everything good going on for them. They're very strong in all areas. Some of them are even fantastic at sport and socially. So
Yep.
they're just
All
dreams to
rounder.
work with. Yet often, yes, students that are higher than that, I find can have a challenge, an executive functioning challenge, or an organisational, a social one. Yeah, I mentioned that before. So I do find that, and then obviously twice exceptional students, and there's a lot of them in schools. yeah, they're a different profile, but because they mightn't necessarily have that really high IQ, but they have that deficit which really inhibits them. And yet, got to work with the strength here, build their confidence, give them some skills that enable them to overcome that challenge, because so often they will overcome it as part of their developmental process through school, especially if they've got someone on the bus with them who can oversee their program and just watch them through the transitions all the time. Uh, yeah, so certainly do see that, and it's very challenging trying to work through um, supporting those students, because it can be really upsetting for them when they've got those blockers or those masks and really frustrating. You know, they know what they want to do, but they just can't get there. So you just support them. Look, it's step by step. We're going to get there. And
Yeah.
so many of them do well in year 12, because by then, they've got enough skills in their toolbox to work through it. And some of that has obviously been that support. I've been in some really good schools with great educators and fantastic teachers, and sometimes I think, the support I provide is perhaps the icing on the cake for some of those students, because they have such great support elsewhere. But it's a gifted and talented coordinator or a talent development director in a school can just provide so much for those students that are highly able, and
Yeah.
just be really personalised in terms of the profiles of gifted students. I was in a school this week, and I was asked a question about profiles of gifted kids, because what I was doing with the staff is workshopping through an evaluation of their program. But Betts and Nyhart, in the gifted field, have profiles of gifted and talented students, and they really explore the different types of gifted kids and how we can best support them. So I've started working through some of that with this school as a result of their questions this week.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned confidence is everything, isn't it? And once you can provide that support to build their confidence,
Yeah.
then take them through step by step what they need to be doing and to achieve their goals. And of course, you mentioned in your book that one of the strategies you use is inquiry-based learning and project-based learning. And I recall when my children were in primary school, they started doing project-based learning and they engaged the families in the learning as well. And
Mm.
it was such a rewarding project for the kids, but also for the families to see how they actually managed their projects. My eldest daughter, decided to design a hammock and build one, real life hammock. So the whole process of actually designing it and then going to Bunnings and choosing the timber and then building it with her dad, and like we've got photos and everything of it that I actually share in presentations now, because that whole process was personalized for the child. They got to
Mm.
choose what they wanted to work on. They had to do the design themselves. Everything was done by themselves, but they could engage their families to help them as well.
Mm.
And it was just so rewarding. And then we had, of course, had an exhibition of all the work for families to come in and have a look at all the students' work. And it's just such a community experience.
Mm.
So can you share how you have implemented these strategies and designed your own programs around inquiry-based learning?
Mm. Yeah, I mentioned in the book that it came from a problem, I guess, or a challenge that my school had with implementing these types of programs. We love inquiry based learning because of the free choice elements that it provides for kids. And, they can ask their own great thought provoking questions to explore, and they can come up with their own topics of things that they might explore as well, like you're sharing. Uh, but initially, the mentoring came out of this, because inquiry learning is great, but it's perhaps a little bit too loose, and there's not enough guidance perhaps in it without maybe a support network such as a mentor. So my master's thesis was on a mentoring and inquiry learning process to support gifted students. So I was looking at both mentoring support for inquiry projects. And it was a case study. I had about 12 students involved and a couple of teachers in terms of putting this research together. But I'd already seen the impact the mentor could have if you met with the students each week about their projects, help them to come up with a plan based on their passions and their interests, and then exploring something that they were interested in exploring, and then helping them to generate their questions around how they'd actually explore it, right from the definitions of the topic right through to the conclusions and findings, because they'd do a research. Often they'd collect data and they'd analyse the data and they'd draw their conclusions, and then they'd draw it back to their initial question on their topic, which is their overarching question. So an example might be, which state or territory is best at producing AFL players, for example.
Awesome debate.
If you've got the tools, you can actually generate some data about that from yearbooks of players and where they've come from, and you can set up some data charts and you can analyse that data and you can draw some conclusions about which state or territory is best at producing AFL players.
I'm very intrigued to know who it is now. I'm guessing either South Australia or Victoria.
Yeah, I think from memory that one, it was a long time ago that the student did the project, but I think it was Victoria was perhaps the best. It may have been South Australia, but those perhaps the AFL was originally the Victorian Football League, so it started in Victoria, but now it's a national competition. But for some of those other states and territories that took a while to connect in, they hadn't performed quite as well. But the year 3 student was able to work through that whole process and then draw some conclusions from the data about their question, and then give some reasons why. And look, I've literally facilitated and supported students through hundreds and hundreds of these projects, and they never cease to amaze me what they come up with. I mean, they're just so wide and varied, and yet the kids are always so passionate about it because it's their choice as to what they're exploring. And then, over the course, usually of the term, they're working through it with the goal setting process, the progress checking and formative discussion, which informs the next lot of goals. And you're working through that in a timely fashion from project start to project completion. Love inquiry learning. I just think a lot of kids, particularly highly able students, really benefit from inquiry processes where they can own their learning, direct it through their own questions, explore things very deeply for themselves. They can go, it's a great way of differentiating and going deeper and deeper and deeper, so that they can draw some, incredible conclusions about their research. So that's how it started for me. The mentoring was through inquiry learning, and then it's kind of evolved into other areas, supporting year 12s through their final year of school. And the last 2 years for me, it's been a lot about mentoring and coaching teachers into new roles, or senior roles that are tricky and difficult, where I've had experience over the years. So that's been a lot of my work the last couple of years. And this year it's evolved into, even school improvement, like big issues around school improvement and supporting schools through it. At one school at the moment, I'm coaching 4 staff, and together the 5 of us are delivering the professional learning then. So I will coach them, we'll work together, we'll have you know, 2 or 3 hours over an afternoon. We'll get ready for what it is we're going to present to the staff, and then we do it together. And that way, there's 4 staff in the school that are there permanently that are really owning that process, and they're already behind it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it started with a lot of questions, that process with those staff members, because they need to own it, and so do the broader staff. So there's a lot of workshopping that I do with them, just the 4 staff I'm working with, and then they help me do the rollout, and we do it together. It's been a really, really rich and rewarding process. So the the mentoring coaching has really evolved. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Mm,
that's a really interesting progression into that area of coaching and mentoring teachers, and a great model so that the what you're implementing is sustainable as well, so that
mm,
you're not just
yeah,
going in there coaching and mentoring and then leaving, but leaving them with the skills as well, which
mm,
is, I'm sure, is going to have a huge impact.
yeah, yeah.
So, in terms of your gifted students, what are your aspirations for them in terms of where they go to after school? Do you see them as, future leaders or future entrepreneurs? Is there, I guess, a vision that you have beyond school for them, in how you actually mentor and support them, and how you're teaching teachers to do the same?
I want them to be happy, challenged, and in a position to be their best selves in learning and in life. That's, I guess, sort of the overarching view. That's all you ever want for your students, for them to be happy, high achieving, being their best selves.
Yeah,
Uh, so that's a real priority, definitely. I want them to have all the skills and the knowledge that they need. So all of that in their toolbox to be able to do it. I mentioned self-actualization before. It is a real journey of personal development that they go on, and especially for someone like me who's been a coordinator in schools for long periods of time, um, where you are going the journey with students for a long time, and you just see enormous change in them over 10 years or 8 years. Uh, and then, because they're inquirers, they know how to ask good questions. They know themselves well. They can just they know how to learn as well as what to learn. They just generate their own path because they have all the tools in their toolbox to do it.
yeah,
Yeah, so that's what I certainly aim to do. I sometimes people say we want them to reach their full potential. I don't say full potential anymore because that suggests a ceiling. And these students will so often go beyond
mm,
what you think their full potential might be. So I don't even say it anymore. I just say I want them to be their best selves, whatever that might be, because so many of them have exceeded what I ever thought they could do. And I think to myself, I just should have believed perhaps a little more. But that's a learning thing for me. Yeah, I hope they'll find vocations that they love, and that suit their skill set. I hope they'll be great contributors to relationships and collaborations and boards or community groups that they get involved in. Yeah, it is. It's very much about equipping them for life and helping them to uh, be their best selves and just know what to do and how to do it.
yeah,
So that's very much what I aim at, and the rest of it's up to them. But
absolutely.
it's an exciting. If there's exciting possibilities ahead. Yeah.
Well, what an absolute gift you've been for those students. And I'm sure that when they look back at their education, they'll picture you in their minds as someone who's really had a positive influence on their lives, especially around getting to know themselves, because what a skill to have, self-mastery and
Mm,
self-actualization is. definitely something that we should be teaching young people from an earlier age rather than waiting till they're in their 40s and 50s to
Yeah.
realize who they are. So I think it's an amazing gift that you've been given to be able to do that. So I'm wondering if you would like to share a little bit more about where people can purchase your book, or if there's anything else you'd like to share about the book, so that we can have more people understanding how to support these beautiful, gifted, talented students.
Yeah, firstly, I'd say to parents, I'm a parent. I've got two children myself. They're grown up now, 26 and 23. But I feel like I've had a lot of input with them as well, my wife and I, over the years. And perhaps the experiences I've had have helped. They both did inquiry projects at school. They both did some mentoring. I probably mentored my son more than my daughter. And sometimes it's a case of, personality matches and what works best. It's certainly for individuals. And yet they both did very, very well at school. So I say this because parents can do a lot in this space. And parents that read my book, I think, can get some really good insights as to how you can support your own gifted and talented child.
Yeah, definitely.
In fact, it's not just a book about mentoring gifted kids. In fact, in the book, I share a mentoring process with some students that are very challenged, and how we help them to be their best selves. And some of that was my most rewarding work, seeing those students do so well in year 12. Um,
It's
you
very
know,
easy to read too. The book is
oh,
very,
good. No, that's good. Yeah, so, parents, I think, can take a lot out of it because they can do a lot. Um, Certainly, it's been really interesting to see how schools are using it. There's about 5 or 6 schools that I know of that are implementing the mentoring processes in my book, either through inquiry learning processes or year 12 mentoring. I'm getting a lot more interest about me as a coach and a mentor in schools. And I'm certainly very willing and happy to help schools with coaching staff or mentoring staff in specific roles. And I set up a proposal for that once I've met with the school, and I, meet with them initially to discuss their needs. But other schools are just using my book, and some schools, I believe, have purchased a copy for each mentor in their school, and to give them a resource and just to support how their mentoring and goal setting and formative follow up is followed,
yeah,
which is great, and it's perfect, I think, for that. So it's a very practical book. Schools can purchase it and just implement the processes within it, or they can, I leave my details at the back if schools or educational leaders would like to follow me up. And I'm very happy to, as I said, to help in that space. And I love mentoring kids as well, but it's more probably about equipping the school how to do that themselves through their staff resources, and how to do that really effectively. I can really help there. The
yeah.
book is available at Amber Press. It came out in July. It's also on Amazon, Barnes and Noble.
Yeah, I'll pop some links in the chat box below so people
Oh,
can
great.
go straight
Uh,
to.
Also, the Council for Educational Leaders, the Australian Council for Educational Leaders, is selling my book as well.
Yep.
So, and there's a couple of other outlets that I saw the other day online that are selling it as well. So, yeah, there's lots and lots of places in which to purchase it.
Yeah.
And I'd encourage you, if you're interested, to have a read, and I think you'll enjoy it and find it very helpful.
Yeah. And fantastic resource and clearly needed, because there are, a lot of schools out there who are probably seeking information and guidance around how to support these students, and also parents as well. So a really good resource to tap into, and obviously tapping into your extensive knowledge and experiences, and the amount of students that you've helped over the years is now being, I guess, valued by other schools now, and that's fantastic. How your career has progressed into this field, and you're clearly passionate about it, and that's shone through in this interview today. So I just want to thank you for your time and sharing your story, and really just giving us an insight into how to support gifted and talented children. And yeah, I look forward to staying connected with you, and also to seeing more of your great work out there. And yeah, so thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks very much for the opportunity, for taking an interest in my book and reading it, and for doing this this recording. Yeah,
You're most
it's been a really enjoyable process. So thank you.
Well, what another inspiring interview in our Leadership in Education series of our Creating Connections podcast. If you enjoyed this interview and would like to learn more from other leaders in education, please click on the subscribe button to receive further podcasts on your feed. If you'd like to be a guest on our podcast, click on the link below to book a meeting with me to learn more about you and your leadership in education. Or if you're listening to this podcast, send an email to rachel@practicallylearning.com.au to express your interest in being on the podcast. If you are a school leader or teacher with aspirations for leadership, but you're challenged with self-doubt, overwhelm, and whether you have what it takes to take that next step, our Connect with Your Mind Mastery Coaching Program can support you to work on your own self-mastery to become the leader you aspire to be. For further information about our coaching and professional learning programs, please visit our website at practicallylearning.com.au, or click on one of the links below and visit our podcast for our future series of interviews to support you as the adults who are guiding children on their learning journey. I do hope you enjoy the rest of our episodes on our Creating Connections podcast, and I hope to meet you soon.